Imagine a world where racism doesn't exist. Imagine a world where a black person is treated in the same way as a white person. Galatians chapter 3 verse 28 says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one under Christ Jesus." This is what the Bible says. Yet, this is not true within our own church. These beliefs are not held to a high standard for Adventists to follow. From the Lucy Byard story to the segregation within our own conferences, to the racist barriers which our church built, to the reinforcement of racist acts within our own schools and churches. This is a documentary which was made to capture the personal narratives, not to attack a person or the church, but in order to spark the conversations that are necessary in order to break down those barriers, so that we may all live together as true followers of Christ Jesus. What does the word racism mean to you?
Okay, to me, the simple definition of racism is basically that book on the shelf, or books on the shelves that people will refuse to open and look into because they don't like what they see on the backside.
For me, racism is just pretty much a prejudice shown to a group of people, usually minority, underprivileged, marginalized group of people, just based on their race.
I think the person who is racist, even if they think it's subconscious, I think they have biases, whether intentional or unintentional, that they actually believe the person of color in some way is less than them.
It means one who has the instilled belief that their race is more superior than another race.
Mainly the word racism to me means something against a race or bias against a race.
Where have you experienced racism within the Adventist community?
That's such an interesting question because I attended Adventist academies from kindergarten to second grade, and then I went to public school from third grade to eighth grade, and then in high school I went back to Adventist academy. And it's interesting that I experienced racism in Adventist academies compared to public school. My earliest memory actually of racism was in second grade. I was playing in the sandbox with two white girls, and at the time I was the only black girl in my entire class. There was one black boy, but he eventually left at some point, and we were playing in the sandbox, and I think at one point we were throwing sand at each other, and we started calling each other poopy faces. And so the teacher comes over and she was like, "All right, you three, you need to go to the principal's office." And you would think that second graders wouldn't go to the principal's office for calling each other names, but we did. And the principal sat myself and the two white girls down. They were on both sides of me, and he was talking about how bad it is to name call or whatever, and looked at me and said, "I think we might have to call your parents." And I remember looking at both girls and I was like, "Well, are you gonna call their parents too?" And he completely disregarded my question and let them leave and called my parents. And you would think I was only around 6 or 7, I believe, and it's so interesting how you see the one person of color in that room and you decide to call their parents over two other girls who did the exact same thing. And from that moment on, that was when I finally realized that, number one, that I'm actually a different color than everyone else, and number two, that I was going to be treated differently than everyone else.
Did you experience anything at the academy or even going to different churches?
Yeah, in high school I definitely did, when I was playing sports and also when I was in classrooms. That was quite often. In church, not so much, because I attended one of the more known black churches, and when I visited other churches it was more so with the choir, so I was always singing, so I didn't really have anything outside of that. But yeah, in high school I definitely did.
Do you have any examples
stories?
I'd say one of the biggest ones was my junior year, I believe it was. I was on JV1. The team was that big, we had to split up. And you know how in sports they have swingers. And so myself and the other black girl on the team were supposed to be swinging so that we could train to go into varsity. And the coaches had met with us and they were like, we're gonna start training guys, whatever, but they kept pushing it back. So of course we were like, whatever. But there were also two white girls that were going to be swingers as well. And over time we started noticing that the coaches were spending more time with them than they were with us. And we would speak to the coaches and we were like, hey, what's going on? And in practices, we're killing it. We're doing what we need to do. And the coaches are just always taking those girls. And eventually, they just completely forgot myself and the other girl and let those two move on to varsity and kept us at JV. And our actual coach of JV1 was like, she sat us down one day and she saw that we were upset. And she was like, I honestly don't even know what to tell you because I recommended you to go up to varsity. And the coaches just made up some excuse and took the other two girls and left us on JV1. Yes, there are a lot of instances where I've dealt with racism from staff, from leaders or whatever in the schools, but there is a lot of racism that comes from students and that teachers refuse to address or acknowledge. And it's things that seem as little as name calling. And I think a lot of times teachers don't know how to address those things. And I think, yes, I understand that we can be hesitant to address those things when we're not educated on that. But if anything, that does nothing instead of invites that environment to continue. And we see situations where at the time when I was in high school, I never felt comfortable talking to anyone at the school about what was going on because all of my teachers, minus two, were white. And all of the students, minus a few, weren't of color. And so I felt like all of the issues that I were facing, I just had to take on with me. And I had to keep shrugging on, or whatever you want to say. And if anything, more students, as I went on, were dealing with same things, if not worse. So yes, racism is very prevalent when it comes to the leaders in the Adventist education system, but the students in the homes, that right there is an even bigger pot.
Actually, unfortunately, I probably experienced racism more so in the school setting, in the private Christian school setting. People have been raised in their narrow mindset, and they're not thinking of what they're saying or what they're doing. They're not thinking of how their actions are affecting somebody else. And yeah, I see that more unfortunately, in our Christian community than in the public sector, outside in public. I mean, obviously you get a little bit, but I see it more so. Well, it hurts you more when it's in a community that you feel you should be safe in.
White Adventists are the most prejudiced of the churches, and the most prejudiced white group. Being in church, having white pastors come to our church and make comments after the choir would have sung, I want to go to your side of heaven when I get to heaven. Like there's a divide because of the music that we sang. Not that our music was way out there, especially, 40 years ago, 45 years ago. Woo, telling on myself. But those were some of the initial, so I was like, huh? Not heaven is one place. But to blatantly hear people make comments that there's going to be a side for black people and a side for white people in heaven.
Have you experienced or noticed anything more recently?
Well, it's never changed.
Yeah.
Those, it's always been that way. I didn't attend an Adventist school until high school, I was at public school in Clackamas County. But it's interesting. I never felt racism from the families and the kids in my neighborhood. And I grew up, everybody went to church back then. And so some went to Lutheran church, some were Catholic, some were Baptist, none were Adventist. And all just nice Christian people. But going to the Adventist high school really really showed me that there is racism within the Adventist church. I was treated differently, looked at in a different way. Like I was less than, our family was less than. Even though my family, we were middle class, upper class. We grew up in Happy Valley. We had horses, we had land, we had, rental property. I mean, my family has done well. The Lord has blessed my parents, and but we were never. It was always an afterthought, like, "Oh, you live there? Oh, you have horses? Oh, you travel?" It was never an assumption. It was already always an assumption that we were less than.
I remember friends telling me that I couldn't go to a banquet because there wasn't anybody of my color. Or I couldn't date anybody because there wasn't anybody of my color. There wasn't anybody like me. What they didn't know is that I'm mixed. So the only person who's like me is my brother. I can't date my brother. So, and I encountered that a lot from my peers. I never had the opportunity to figure out if it was coming up from any higher because I couldn't date anybody. So it never, the authorities never, or teachers or staff members, it was never an issue for them to address, to talk to anybody about, because it never got that far for them to have that opportunity to talk about it. And I never told anybody about it because for some reason I thought, oh, well, maybe that's the truth.
Where have you seen racism in the Adventist community?
I have seen it the way that individuals treat people who come from a different country. I've seen it how people deal with someone who speaks a different language, or how they speak differently, whether it's some form of exclusion, of not allowing them to participate, or talking negative about them or to someone else about them. I've seen exclusion from using spaces, and the individuals that were involved did not recognize that they were being prejudiced or racist against a different group. And I actually commented to the pastor of the particular church the church was doing something wrong against this other group of people. I actually commented to them that if this other group of people were Caucasians or whites, you would not have treated them the way that you treated those people. And he looked at me and he had nothing to say. Because it is true, if they had been another white Adventist church in that particular situation, they would have worked with them and resolved the issues without a problem. But because they were not, because they spoke a different language, they got treated like secondhand individuals, and I was very sad to know that this particular pastor didn't seem too worried or concerned in righting the wrong in that particular situation.
Okay. So I can go way back as far as my family, because my grandfather was an Adventist minister in the late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, till he passed in the 70s. And the first story I heard was workers' meeting, which is a gathering of all of the Adventist pastors. And at lunchtime, they pulled a bifold door, and the black pastors had to eat on one side of the room, and the white pastors had to eat on the other side of the room. So hearing that story is like, that's the beginning of my Adventist experience with racism. It's the wife of my grandfather wanted to be a nurse, applied to the white Adventist school, and they had reached their quota for black students. So she was unable to be a nurse, ended up becoming a teacher, because if you're married to a pastor, you're a nurse or you're a teacher. But she became a teacher, but okay, another, like, they reached the quota.
I feel like the Adventist community is predominantly white, and I think that right there is a huge component of racism. I don't see much multiculturality, and I don't even know if that's a word, but I don't see much of that. I see it in the schools, which I think are white culture. I think the education is white culture. I see it in the conference office, and I know that there are leaders in the Adventist community that are people of color. I know there are churches that are for people of color, but I don't think that there's enough. And I think overall, the majority of the leadership is still white.
How has racism in the Adventist community affected your journey with God and with the church?
From what I've learned in my upbringing, there is a text in Matthew 5, talking about, if someone should slap you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. And so that was something that I did. Someone would insult me, I wouldn't say anything. You just turn and let them hit you again, or you just keep on walking. That was one. And the other was the golden rule, doing unto others. And I just knew that even if these people were, through their ignorance, or what they would say, if they were even being hurtful to me, I wouldn't address it, but I would treat them, obviously try and treat them nicely, the way that I would want to be treated. And so I think in that aspect, I got to learn, or I had to rely on those kind of things to be the Christian to follow. I probably never really understood the full impact of that until I got older, to realize that here my peers were looking at that going, she's always really nice, or she always seems very confident, which basically a lot of that came from, well, you hit me on one side of the face, I'm not hitting you back. I'm going to let you continue. I'm still going to go through. I never felt like God abandoned me in that aspect, in my personal relationship. But I think that just kind of helped me to say, if I want to be a good Christian, this is what I need to do.
I haven't let it affect my true belief and understanding, because it's a matter of having a relationship with God and not these people. So I don't look to people. We're always taught don't look to people. And so, I'm going to believe what I believe as truth. And I'm thankful I have that foundation. There are so many who don't. So many of my friends who I grew up with who to this day denounce the Adventist church and have had such negative experiences at the academy that they don't want to come back.
Like I shared with you the story of the one pastor that I had to deal with, I will tell you that it made me sad for that particular pastor, for the people around him that were involved in that situation. Although I had assumed a lot more individuals of authority in that particular church knew about the particular situation, I discovered later that there were very few people who actually knew of what happened, the actual details. And so it made me very sad for the pastor. It's made it a little more difficult internally for me to work with that individual. It makes it really hard to go to church and listen to a sermon and truly take it in, knowing that they've had this position, this attitude towards others, that's not appropriate in any way, fashion, or form.
Being in the Adventist community, I feel like it was just always made aware that I was Black and that everybody else was white. And because of that, it really felt like it didn't really feel like a safe place. I didn't really feel like this was a place that I would want to bring my kids for school. And I don't know if I would want my kids to go to these churches because I always felt like an outcast in a weird way.
It makes me feel less welcome because my family is a multiracial family. And so knowing that I feel like the Adventist community does not embrace diversity the way I'd like it to, it keeps me maybe one step removed from feeling completely engaged with it. I feel like I kind of keep a wall. So there are components within the Adventist religion that I believe in, but in terms of the community, I don't feel like I am really part of it.
You would think that when you deal with these issues that it would make you so angry at God and question God so much. And I think if anything, it made me want to figure out who God was more for myself, because when I was going through these things, that's when the foundations of my relationship with Christ was growing, and it wasn't matching up. These things that these pastors were telling me in class weren't matching up with the things that teachers were doing to me. And so oftentimes I found myself just communicating with God more, and I think if anything it really showed me that racism is a man-made thing and it has nothing to do with Christ. And so it didn't really affect my relationship with Christ. If anything, I think it just showed me more how messed up and screwed up this world is compared to God, because I had to figure out who God was for myself and figure out that God is actually accepting and loving and that these are humans that are doing these things.
I actually don't think it has had a huge impact on my relationship with God. The back answer to that is that's kind of sad, because I actually don't think that the Adventist community is very representation. It does not represent God's love. So for me, it has not changed how I view God because I don't view Adventist as being godlike.
What change do you aspire to see addressing racism in the Adventist community?
What I would love to see in our Adventist community, it would be probably more of a, what do you say, a melding of the minds, you know, the meshing of the cultures of, I get that there's reasons why you have an Afro-American church or why you have a Chinese church or a Spanish church, but I think if we had the opportunities where all these cultures could come together again, or have opportunities where cultures can learn other cultures, whatnot, I think it would probably bring a better unity. Fear is fed because we don't understand. It's the unknown. If you've got your Latino population, we don't just put them over there. Let's have events where we can actually hang out with them, so we can actually learn how they are, what they eat, what, you know, and let's do that with the Afro-American culture, and let's just do that with the Asian cultures. And I think if we got a lot more of that, I think it'll bring more unity in our church system. I think also too, when you see that at the church level and we see that rise up into leadership, that's really important. You know, don't have a minority person just for the minority department. We want to see them ahead in a major department. That's going to help impact the rest of the culture.
The change I'd like to see around racism is that it's identified, that people are willing to stand for what's right and not to get pulled into what's easy. Because being a true leader and making change takes courage, and that's what I would like to see, is that the leadership steps forward, denouncing what's wrong and embracing what's right.
Well, I would like to see the church actually say Black Lives Matter and continue to stand behind it. I think that would speak to a lot of our Black membership if the church leadership actually made that statement. To me, that's
The main thing.
that's a big one.
Okay.
So not only would I like to see leadership changes in who specifically take on leadership roles, I would also like to see changes in the education. I would like to see the curriculum changing to address what we now know is a white culture curriculum, and allow curriculums that not only support diversity, but actually teach our kids how to be anti-racist, instead of fostering the biases that are built into the education department. I would like to see churches embrace diversity on a much deeper level than calling a potluck with different types of foods as justification for how diverse a church is. I would like to see a church show its diversity to the people in the actual service by who is coming and speaking. I would like to see more sermons put on by people of color, even if it is a predominantly white church. And by that, I mean not just American people of color. I mean people who are coming here to speak to us, but that we can learn from, because their experiences are different than ours. And I think that will bring more diversity to us.
I would appreciate more open and honest conversations, number one. We know that in the church, we like to sugarcoat things. We like to make things seem less than what they really are. And I feel like as a church, we cannot grow and we cannot truly say that we are the remnant church if we are not acknowledging and addressing the issues that people of God are facing. So I'd love to see more conversations and more acknowledgement of what's going on and what has happened in the past.
If you could say anything to the white leaders in the Adventist church and the Adventist community, what would you say?
My words to you, what I would say to you would be, look at me. Whether you see me as a person of color or not, I am a person of color. Other people will see me as a person of color. And maybe your words to me is that you love me and that you would take care of me. But what would you do to stop other people from hurting me or treating me with injustice? That's what I would say.
If I could say anything to the white leaders, I would say trust God and not man. God's word is clear on how we should treat our brethren, and if we're willing to look at history and believe what was written in history, then we can see that that wasn't right, and the things that were done haven't been right. But we have an opportunity, and as leaders, you have an opportunity to right the wrongs that have been done. And I challenge you to do that. Step out on faith, the faith you preach about, teach about, encourage us all to have. I would encourage you to embrace that same faith when it comes to racism and addressing the evils of this world.
There is a whole community of people, specifically the black communities, the black Adventists, who truly are dealing with the different effects of racism in our world today. And socially, politically, in many different ways, in fashion or forms. And if the Adventist leadership can just take the time, acknowledge that there is a issue, that they're willing to sit down with the black community, the minority community, and hear what needs to be done to change. Not come and say, well, this is what we need to do to change, but actually just sit down and listen and hear the hearts of the communities. So that the healing can start.
I would say, please be willing to move aside and we need people of color to be in leadership roles. We need more people of color in education. We need more people of color in all the departments, both with our local conference and higher up. I know that there are some people of color in leadership positions, but I just don't think that it is enough to really represent our population. I think if we want something other than a white culture church, which is what I think we need to have, then I think we have to change the leadership and make it as diverse as we want the people to be.
I would say that you can't truly call yourself a follower of Christ and a disciple of Christ if you refuse to acknowledge and address the issues that we're facing. Along with the changes that I want to see from the church, change really starts with us. It starts with the leaders, the voices of the church. And we need you to speak on our behalf, because a lot of people in the church won't hear what's going on if you're not even acknowledging it.
I think my generation struggles to have these conversations because, one, we have gone through this transition of now we need to be politically correct. And so in being politically correct, I think a lot of people feel like it's not a topic to talk about. They don't know how to approach. Well, I would say one of the things that needs to happen first is if it's something that you don't understand or you want to learn more about, research, find out, read about it, before you have the conversations with, if it is basically talking about racism to another person of color and you don't feel comfortable, find out some history first. There's a lot of resources out there, from YouTubes to books to podcasts, where I think if you were able to get some of the background information before you have those conversations, because I think anybody is always willing to talk about issues or to try and have a better understanding, to have the opportunity to explain their perspective. But don't be lazy, basically. I think especially in the current times, I've had a lot of people who would come straight up to me and say, what can we do? What are your thoughts? And it's very exhausting because these last several months have been very exhausting. It's an emotional battle that we've been going through that has come to the forefront, that has been in the news, and we've had to continue to try and defend or to explain our perspectives. And when all of a sudden you have a lot of white people who are like bombarding you and questioning you, it does become very exhausting.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and to listen to each and every one of their stories. Thank you for thinking about what each of them said and about the change that they want to see. Now I ask you, what can you do now? Not tomorrow, not in 10 years, not in 100 years. What can you do now to create change within the Adventist community, to make it a place that welcomes everyone? What can you do? Now go out and do it. Thank you.